Welcome to the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner Prepcast, where we guide you through everything you need to know for your certification exam. Whether you're just starting or looking to refine your knowledge, this course will set you up for success. Brought to you by baremetalcyber.com. Let's get started. Welcome to the Domain 2 audio quiz. This session is designed to strengthen your ability to reason through scenarios and select the right AWS tool or control. Instead of memorizing endless lists, we'll practice identifying boundaries, choosing between overlapping options, and recognizing which service is best suited for a given problem. Think of this as a guided rehearsal. I'll describe common situations you might face in both real-world environments and exam scenarios, and you'll consider which AWS tool or practice applies. For beginners, quizzes like this are less about getting every answer instantly correct and more about training your mind to follow the logic patterns that AWS expects. Imagine you are asked about who is responsible for applying database patches on Amazon RDS. The scenario highlights the shared responsibility model. AWS manages the underlying infrastructure, including patching the database engine, but customers are still responsible for data classification, backups, and access controls. The correct reasoning is to recognize the boundary line. AWS secures the cloud infrastructure, and customers secure their applications and data within it. On the exam, answers often hinge on identifying whether the responsibility belongs to AWS or to you as the customer. Now consider a question that asks whether to use an IAM policy or a resource policy to grant access. IAM policies are attached to users, groups, or roles and determine what those identities can do. Resource policies, like bucket policies in S3, are attached directly to resources and define who can interact with them. If you are asked to allow external accounts to access your bucket, the correct choice is a resource policy. If the scenario is about controlling what your own team members can do, the answer is an IAM policy. The key is matching the scope of the question to the right type of policy. Another scenario: how do you detect when the AWS root account is used? Root usage should be rare and immediately flagged. The best answer is enabling CloudTrail and creating alarms in CloudWatch or EventBridge that trigger when root login events occur. These alarms can notify administrators instantly so they can verify why root access was used. Beginners should remember that root account use is always a red flag. On the exam, if you see a question about root account monitoring, CloudTrail with alerting is the correct match. Let's look at S3. Suppose you need to prevent buckets from being exposed publicly. The most effective control is block public access, which can be applied at the account or bucket level. While bucket policies and ACLs can manage permissions, block public access overrides them to ensure nothing is accidentally exposed. If the question asks about preventing mistakes rather than detecting them after the fact, block public access is the tool to choose. Think of this as a master override switch that keeps your storage from going public unintentionally. Next, consider a scenario about KMS key policies versus IAM permissions. If a question asks who can use or administer a specific key, the answer involves the key policy. If it's asking which actions a user or role can take with KMS generally, IAM permissions apply. Beginners should remember that key policies are the source of truth for the key itself, while IAM policies shape the actions identities can attempt. Often both are needed, but on the exam the wording will guide you toward one or the other. Imagine a question that presents different edge protection services: WAF, Shield, or Firewall Manager. WAF is used to filter web traffic and block threats like SQL injection. Shield protects against DDoS attacks at the network layer, with Shield Advanced adding stronger protections and support. Firewall Manager enforces policies consistently across accounts. If the question asks about blocking SQL injection, choose WAF. If it's about large-scale volumetric attacks, Shield is the answer. If it's about scaling those protections across an enterprise, Firewall Manager fits. The exam often tests this kind of service-to-problem mapping, Guard duty findings may also appear in exam scenarios. For example, if a question asks what to do when guard duty reports suspicious activity, the answer is not to rebuild everything immediately. The proper response is triage. Investigate the finding, confirm its severity, and follow incident response playbooks. Guard duty is a detective service, so actions flow into investigation and remediation workflows, often involving detective or security hub. Beginners should remember, guard duty raises alerts, but your job is to interpret and respond, not panic. Inspector questions usually focus on vulnerability prioritization. If the exam asks how to manage many findings, look for answers that involve evaluating severity, exploitability, and exposure. Fixing the highest risk vulnerabilities first is the correct approach. Automated remediation with Systems Manager runbooks may be part of the answer, but prioritization is key. For learners, think of Inspector as delivering a medical test result. Not every finding needs immediate surgery, but some demand urgent treatment. Recognizing the difference is what the exam wants you to demonstrate. CloudTrail scenarios often ask about multi-account design. The best practice is to enable organization-wide trails and direct logs to a central S3 bucket for all accounts. This ensures consistent, tamper-resistant records. If a question suggests enabling trails separately in each account without centralization, that is less secure and harder to manage. Beginners should always choose the centralized, organization-wide option when asked about logging. It ensures oversight and auditability across the entire environment. Config also appears frequently in scenario questions. If the exam describes a need to enforce encryption on all S3 buckets, the correct tool is AWS Config with an encryption rule. Config continuously evaluates resources and can even trigger remediation when violations are found. The important distinction is that Config enforces compliance with policies, while CloudTrail simply records actions. On the exam, if you see enforcement or continuous compliance, Config is the right match. Artifact questions usually focus on audits. If an auditor requests a society report, PCI attestation, or ISO certification, the correct source is AWS Artifact. Security Hub does not provide these documents, nor does Guard Duty or Config. Beginners should remember that Artifact is AWS's compliance evidence library, offering official paperwork rather than live monitoring. If a question asks about providing formal proof of compliance, Artifact is the service to select. Security Hub questions often emphasize standards like CIS or AWS Foundational Best Practices. If the exam scenario asks how to view overall compliance with a standard across accounts, Security Hub is the correct choice. It aggregates findings from other services and maps them to benchmarks, providing dashboards and scores. Beginners should see Security Hub as the central scorekeeper of compliance posture, while other services provide raw findings. Finally, consider a Macy alert scenario. If Macy reports that an S3 bucket contains sensitive data such as social security numbers, the next step is to secure that bucket, apply block public access, enforce encryption, and review policies. On the exam, the right answer is not to disable Macy but to act on its findings. Macy detects sensitive data, and your responsibility is to reduce risk by tightening controls. Beginners should see Macy as the flashlight that finds valuables, which you then must lock away properly. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. When approaching exam questions, one of the most reliable reasoning strategies is elimination. Often, 2 or 3 answer choices are clearly out of scope. If the scenario is asking about providing audit reports, any option like Guard Duty or Config can be discarded immediately, leaving Artifact as the only logical fit. This process of elimination works even when you're uncertain of the exact service. Beginners should remember, on the exam, wrong answers are often distractors. They sound technical, but don't match the problem. Crossing them out quickly improves your odds and saves precious time. Another common reasoning pattern is mapping symptoms to the most direct service. If a scenario mentions suspicious network activity, guard duty is the first tool to consider. If the question describes unpatched software, inspector is the clear answer. If the theme is compliance evidence, artifact is unmatched. Beginners should picture this like visiting different doctors. A broken bone requires an orthopedist, while heart concerns require a cardiologist. Each AWS service specializes in a specific problem, and the exam rewards matching the symptom to the correct specialist. When choosing between controls, always prefer preventive guardrails if available. For example, preventing public S3 access with block public access is stronger than waiting for alerts after exposure. Config rules and SCPs in AWS organizations are also preventive, blocking non-compliant configurations before they spread. The exam often highlights this principle by offering both a detection and a prevention tool as choices. Beginners should default toward prevention unless the scenario explicitly frames detection or investigation. Access questions frequently test your understanding of least privilege and short-lived credentials. Long-term access keys or broad policies are almost never the correct answer. Instead, the exam prefers temporary session tokens via IAM roles or identity center and tightly scoped permissions. For learners, this is like issuing guest passes to a building for a single day, instead of handing out master keys. Least privilege combined with short-lived access minimizes risk, and AWS emphasizes this repeatedly. Encryption is another default assumption in AWS exams. If the scenario involves storing or transmitting sensitive data, the right choice is to encrypt it and verify with KMS or TLS. Answers that suggest leaving encryption optional should raise red flags. Beginners should see encryption as the seatbelt of cloud operations. It's expected to be in use by default, and the exam will often test whether you apply it automatically rather than conditionally. Centralized logging and monitoring is another common exam theme. CloudTrail organization-wide trails and central S3 log storage are always better answers than fragmented account-by-account setups. Similarly, CloudWatch dashboards and alarms provide visibility across systems. Beginners should remember, the exam values solutions that unify and centralize oversight rather than leaving islands of monitoring. Choose the option that provides one trusted record of activity, not many partial ones. Automation is often the preferred approach when the question asks about handling issues at scale. For example, config rules tied to Systems Manager automation can fix misconfigurations automatically. Guard duty findings can trigger event bridge rules to quarantine resources. Beginners should understand that in AWS, safe automation is a best practice. Manual processes are acceptable for small teams but won't scale, and the exam reflects this preference for automation when the option is presented. Security must also be cost-aware. AWS emphasizes that while services like Macie and KMS are powerful, they come with costs tied to usage. The exam may present scenarios where cost control is part of the solution, such as applying lifecycle policies to S3 logs or choosing when to enable high-volume data event logging in CloudTrail. Beginners should see cost as part of governance, securing resources wisely without creating unnecessary financial burden. Smart design balances both. Cross-account aggregation shows up frequently in governance scenarios, whether it's CloudTrail logs, Security Hub findings, or inspector results. The best practice is to consolidate data into a central account for analysis. This prevents tampering, reduces duplication, and ensures oversight. Beginners should see this as consolidating all reports into a single headquarters rather than leaving each branch to guard its own papers. On the exam, if centralization is an option, it is usually the right one. Audits demand evidence, not opinions. The exam may present a scenario where a regulator asks for proof that AWS data centers meet standards. The correct answer is always to provide artifact documentation, not verbal assurances. Evidence is the only valid response in compliance situations. For learners, this reinforces a key truth. Compliance is about showing receipts, not simply claiming you follow best practices. Artifact provides that credible proof. The simplest exam rule is to choose the tool that matches the task. Don't overcomplicate it. If the question is about detecting threats, GuardDuty is the answer. If it's about encryption key management, KMS is the answer. If it's about sensitive data discovery, Macy is the answer. The exam will sometimes disguise these with longer wording, but the task always points to the right tool. Beginners should resist second-guessing once they map the problem to its logical AWS service. One practical exam tip is to pay close attention to qualifiers in the question. Words like across all accounts, in a specific region, or at the network edge often signal which service is appropriate. For example, if the qualifier is organization-wide, think organizations, SCPs, or Central Security Hub findings. If it says edge, think WAF or Shield. Beginners should train themselves to underline qualifiers mentally. They often decide the answer. Another important exam strategy is time management. There is no penalty for guessing, so if you are unsure, mark your best choice and move on. Getting stuck on one question wastes valuable time that could be used answering easier ones. On a 50-question exam, each question is worth about 2% of the score. Beginners should remember that it is better to finish with educated guesses than to run out of time leaving blanks. In conclusion, the Domain 2 quiz is less about memorizing trivia and more about learning patterns. Eliminate distractors quickly, map symptoms to the correct tool, and favor preventative controls over reactive ones. Always think in terms of least privilege, encrypting by default, and centralizing where possible. Automate when safe, stay cost-aware, and choose evidence over opinion. On the exam, qualifiers and questions are clues, and efficient time management is your ally. By practicing these patterns, learners can approach each question with confidence, recognizing not just the right answer, but the reasoning behind it. That concludes today's episode of the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner Prepcast. Be sure to tune in for the next episode and visit us online at baremetalcyber.com or cyberauthor.me for more resources, including news, mailing lists, YouTube videos, podcasts, and much more.